This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leeuw Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin. Every week we talk about books and research and things that we find fascinating. Our guest today might be called a Renaissance woman. She is a screenwriter and editor who was the deputy editor for one of the country's most popular satire shows, Eretz Nehederet, and other hit television shows. She's currently a writer and columnist for Yediot Achronot, formerly with Haaretz, and an actress. Her name is Mika Almog, and we will be talking today about a book of her short stories that's just been published. It's called Anticipation. It's not yet in English, unfortunately. It was published by Kinneret Zmora Bitan Dvir in 2017. So we'll be talking mostly about that book and a few other things. Mika also happens to be the granddaughter of Shimon Peres, and she's been involved in some of his communication in the past. We might ask you a thing or two about him since his death is just over a year ago. And we've been asked to tell our listeners that she makes a mean gin and tonic. Mika Almog, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
You know, it's always interesting starting to talk about a book with a collection of short stories where, you know, the topics are very different. So before we get into any particular story, I want to tell you that the thing that stood out for me is that in many of these stories, there is a character who is on the outside looking in at other people's lives, you know, imagining them as rich and famous and successful, and the character is sort of alienated in some level. Would you say that's a connecting theme in this book, and why?
Yeah, I think that's very insightful. I think a lot of the characters in the book are indeed outside looking in, and sometimes they are outside of a life that they aspire to have, looking into that life, and sometimes they are outside of themselves, and what they hope for and what they're craving more than anything is a sort of entrance into themselves. I called the book Anticipation, and one of the norms with short story collections is that the writer will pick one of the names of the stories within the book, and that will become the title of the book. And I chose not to do that because I felt that there was indeed a theme that runs throughout the book, and I think anticipation is such a basic human state. You know, we wake up in the morning anticipating what our day will be like, and sometimes, you know, anticipation can be a very small thing about, you know, meeting a friend and hoping that we'll have a nice intimate chat, and sometimes anticipation is about the far wider and greater things in our lives,
and it always falls short of reality.
And yeah, you know, when it actually happens, you know, we live our lives waiting for something to happen, okay? And when it does, if it does, it often doesn't match our expectations. And so I think one of the things that the 20 stories in the collection have in common is that each and every character in each and every story find themselves in the exact spot that they did not want to be in. And that spot is always a place where one's expectations meet reality. And it's a point at which, in which there's always a lot of pain, but there can also be a lot of compassion. And some of the stories, that moment can be very funny, very endearing, and it's often an opportunity for people to learn something new about themselves and grow from it.
I find it very interesting that you said that they end up in a place where they don't want to be, because it's certainly in one story that particularly caught my attention, the imagination or the anticipation is about quite a negative scene, and I'm thinking of the one that I guess I would translate as Concerto for a Fist. Is that how you would translate that?
For a punch. Actually.
For a punch,
yeah.
Okay, for a punch. And you have a character who's full of rage, and the anticipation is letting that rage, you know, spill out into a very deep, dark place, but he ends up in staying what you would say maybe in the situation you didn't want to be in, but it's a rather less violent situation. Is that a contradiction? Or
no, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but what happens to this gentleman is that he's an architect and he spends his entire life building and creating. And then he finds himself in a situation where he realizes that right under the surface of his very authentic desire to build and create lies a desire no less authentic to destroy, to let go of this rage that he's feeling. And the rage is against represents this, machinery of life. So it comes into the way he experiences it is through being an architect and through everything that he needs to go to, through facing the municipality so he can build houses for people. And he's frustrated. This is also a very Israeli story because the experience is very Israeli. He can build houses for other people, but he can't afford his own home for himself. And he has to, a lot of his clients come to him and say, well, I have this machil, and this machil, you'll just pay him 6,000 shekels and he'll fix everything with the, Tel Aviv municipality or whoever. And so he's hugely frustrated and he has this desire. And then he has this encounter with a gentleman at the coffee shop where he's meeting clients. And the gentleman is convinced that he cut in line, that he's going to get a table before him, which he should not have. And he enters this state of a very profound desire to express all of his rage in a very, very, very violent manner. But of course, the price of engaging the fantasy is that he will lose everything he has and everything he hopes to have. And so, again, I also think that part of anticipation is that sometimes the things that we dream of and we yearn for aren't necessarily the things that will really take our lives into a better place.
Otherwise known as be careful what you wish for.
No, I actually had different thoughts about this story because it wasn't so much about his profession, but rather his character. The fact that he's, very concerned about propriety and is well-mannered and well-behaved. And when he's you said it's very Israeli, it's very un-Israeli that when he was told to queue, he queues patiently for half an hour until a table, he gets a table. And then, underneath the surface, all this rage builds up. And it's really the tension between what he is on the outside. Perhaps, it's also a metaphor for architecture, what it is outside compared to what it is on the inside.
And I think this also connects to what Dalia was saying earlier, because he has an experience of always being an outsider. He's an Israeli, but he says there's a point where he remembers being a child that he always used to get beat up on. And he says maybe it's my light hair, my green eyes. He wasn't an outsider, but he always felt like one. And he always felt like from that point on, they really didn't need much of an excuse. His very existence bothered them.
I want to ask you again a general question about the stories. They all seem to me to be highly contemporary. I mean, I always imagine them, happening somewhere right now.
Yeah.
Do you feel very connected to the here and now? I mean, I was thinking about asking you, perhaps a segue into that question. How old is the oldest story in the collection?
I probably started working on this book about 4 years ago. When I wrote for Haaretz magazine, I currently write for Yediot Ahronot, but when I wrote for Haaretz, I had a personal column, and when I first started writing it, I wrote it in the standard format of a personal column, so first-person experiences from my life, and I got kind of bored with it fairly quickly.
Your life just isn't that exciting.
No, first of all, not necessarily that exciting. Second, I also very quickly realized that the level of my willingness to expose my personal life, a lot of personal columnists write about their home life, their children, and I always felt like the people in my life have a right to stay anonymous and to keep their lives private, and just because I chose to be in a certain limelight should not commit my children, especially. And then one week I did have this interesting experience, and I ended up writing it in the format of a short story, and I sent it to my editor, and he wrote me an email which I will never forget, and he said, the text reads like a riddle, but it's not uninteresting. And I thought, okay,
Such a typical response from an editor.
I never looked back. And so first of all, I will forever aim for my text to be not uninteresting. But I went on to publish about 120 short stories in Haaretz, and these are very short stories. They're like in a newspaper page can contain about 800 words or so. But it was an unbelievable writing school because I wrote for publication every week, and I wrote about 120 of these. So in a sense, you could say that my writing of short stories began back then, and there are a few stories in the book which are versions of far more, developed and longer versions, more sophisticated versions, but of those stories that began back then.
But do you
the
feel
writing
that
is
really
contemporary. It is very much about the here and now. And some of it are experiences from my life. Some of it are, and one of the writing experiences that I love the most is actually writing about people who are nothing like me. So if I can write from the voice of a man, like in Concerto for a Punch, there's a story called Zchut HaTishtush. How would you translate that?
The right to be confused or the right to be...
It's interesting. The right to... Well, it's about blurry eyesight,
right to blur.
but the main character...
The right to blur, maybe.
The right to blur, yeah. So the main character is an Arab woman living in an Arab village, and she's short-sighted, and she takes this little break from life every night when she cooks with her eyeglasses off. And she can't see, but when she's cooking, there's a description that when she's cooking, her fingers see for her, and she chops and she does everything she needs to do. And then a very violent episode happens right outside her window, and she just rushes to the window to close it, and people see her from downstairs. And so the next morning, she becomes a witness. And now the village people are on her, and the security forces, and everybody wants her to give them an eyewitness testimony, which she cannot give because she didn't actually see it. So, she lives a life that is very, very different from mine. I did bring in an experience of mine, which is being short-sighted.
Well, I think there's probably always an element of the writer. And it's fascinating to think about what a writer goes through to be inside a character that's not you. But before we get to that, I want to ask you something that you started to raise before. I think back when we were talking about Concerto for a Punch, which is many of these situations seem very Israeli, right?
Yeah.
These are daily situations that we face all the time. I bet everybody's had that experience of somebody cutting in front of you or thinking somebody cut in front of you. And, many things in the book that just stand out from life here. To what extent were you consciously trying to capture Israeli life, or you're just saying, I'm writing universal stories, but they happen to be based on the context that I know well?
I would go more for the latter definition, because I do think that at heart the stories are universal and do translate and can be read by anyone anywhere. But I live here. I am Israeli. This is where I grew up. This is where I live now. And Israel is a war zone. And it's not just a war zone when we're at war. And it's not just a war zone because of the part of the world that we live in our history. It's a war zone in many ways in our mentality and the way people live their everyday lives. So there's a lot of violence embedded into Israeli. Anyone who drives in Israel can feel the violence on the road. And this isn't just road rage, that it exists everywhere. There's a sense that you constantly need to fight for your survival. And I think that this really trickles down into everything that we do. And every once in a while, when you stop and you notice it, you kind of take it for granted. Sometimes you can feel it when you go abroad and you suddenly realize, that there are basic things. When I'm abroad, I feel like people look me in the eye more. They smile at me more. There's not... Israelis, on the one hand, are very warm and open and loving people, and they'll host you in their homes. But on the street, on a daily basis, it's people won't necessarily just say hello to a stranger or smile at someone. And a lot of that exists in the stories. There's one story called Ga'guai Lemiklat, which is my longing for shelter. And there's a character there, and his name is Eitan. And he's a kind of he's see-through. He feels that no one can see him. And so he goes to places where he will be seen. And one of these places is the supermarket. And when he goes there, he makes these little messes, So he goes to the cheese stand and he says, "Can I have 283 grams, please?" And he starts,
But he gets a smile out of the cheese cutter.
And he does this for a good reason. But there's one point where he talks about his longing for the time when there was a war going on, and he would be in the supermarket, and suddenly the alarm would go off and everybody would run for shelter as one, because he describes this situation where when we are at war and we're all hiding in the shelter and bombs are falling on us from the sky, people see one another in a way that they don't in everyday life. And I think that's something very Israeli. We come together. It's also very human. So again, there's a meeting point between the Israeli and the universal.
I wanted to ask you about the format of short stories, because, going back to my earlier question about, the contemporary and perhaps a somewhat uniform style to the stories, it seems to me like some of the protagonists and some of the stories could have been weaved into a novel. I mean, different characters in this same story. Was that ever an option? Did you ever consider it?
It's interesting because, it always, first of all, I am a huge fan of the short story genre. I think it's a wonderful genre. It tends to get a little belittled. It always seems to take second place to novels. And I read this really interesting interview with Alice Munro, who is, of course, the great goddess of short stories. And she said that for years she carried around a sense of failure because she tried to write a novel and couldn't, until she finally realized that short stories were her art form. So I love short stories, and I did not set out to write a novel and settled for short stories. This was always meant to be a short story collection, but I do hope and plan to write a novel as well. But I don't necessarily see it as a step up. I really think they're different genres, and I think certainly what I aspired to do with this collection of short stories is to give readers both a complete experience within each story and yet also a wider experience in the reading of the book as a whole.
Do you agree with me that they could have been weaved into a novel, or am I
You mean
far
connection
off?
between the stories? Yes, I think some of them could have been connected. That did cross my mind at one point, but then when I tried to, if you're going to do it, you need to commit to doing it for the whole book. And at one point, I felt like I was bending some of the stories too hard to make them fit that, and then I really let it go. But I'll tell you another interesting story, which is that I got a very, very moving phone call from Aleph Bet Yoshua, who read the book. And I was actually driving, and I answered the phone number I didn't recognize. Shalom, medaber Buli, which is his nickname, Buli. And I stopped the car so I wouldn't crash it. And he said wonderful things about the book, which was very moving and exciting. But he also said that he thought I made a wonderful choice by having my first book be a collection of short stories, and that one of the tips that he gives to first-time writers is to not start with a novel, but to experience storytelling through this genre.
That's exactly
of
how
writing
he
short
started
stories.
off, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I personally don't share the sense of inferiority for short stories. I think they're masterful because you have to be really compact and focused.
Yeah.
And there's a level of drama in these that I don't know who your influences are. You mentioned Alice Munro, but now that I'm thinking about it, it reminds me a little bit of Raymond Carver, right?
Yes, definitely Raymond Carver and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who wrote amazing short stories, and also some of the contemporary writers, Miranda Julie, who does an amazing job with short stories. There's an African writer, her name, she wrote a collection of short stories called That Thing Around Your Neck. I read a lot of short stories all the time, so my influences are far and wide.
Right.
And I actually, when I was working on the book, made a point of reading short stories almost only in English because I wanted to, be inspired without being influenced too much.
And you were preparing to appear on the Tel Aviv Review as well.
Yes,
of
naturally.
course.
But that's interesting that you must have had English cadence in your head while you were writing these short stories in Hebrew.
Yeah, but I am bilingual. I lived in
I
Boston.
hadn't noticed.
Yeah, I lived in Boston as a child, so my thinking is very much in Hebrew and in English simultaneously. But at the end of the day, when you write in Hebrew, and I do live here, and my roots are here, and my kids are here, and my work is here, and I read in Hebrew all the time. So I think that's why I was able to make that separation. Although every once in a while, my editor did write, a highlighted note, and it said Hebrish, and then I would have to fix, something in the syntax.
I'm thinking again of these the Israeli-ness about these stories, and you were talking about the level of sort of aggression and violence behind some of them. One example, I want to give you the opportunity to read from this story, is a painful short story that I think could be rather universal, but you've given it this title, Shoot Me in the Head, which, maybe we say something in English like Kill Me Now, but there's a particularly graphic element to that. Can you tell us what inspired this story? And if you want to, you should feel welcome to read some.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. It's interesting because there are some stories in the book where I can tell you this story was triggered by something I read, this story was triggered by a personal experience or by a story someone told me. And then there are a few stories which, speaking of Shoot Me in the Head, with a gun to my head, I could not tell you what their origin was. And this is one of them. I really can't say. Sometimes I wake up with a sentence and I write it down and the work starts from there. And this is one of those stories where I really can't say what its origin was. But it's told by Ruth, and Ruth is married to Kobi. And in the background of their lives is Atalia, which actually when reading it, you may not be able to tell. So this is a bit of a spoiler. You may not be able to tell straight from the beginning, but Atalia is Kobi's wife.
Yeah, I certainly didn't pick up on it until the end.
Yeah, who was struck by a very cruel disease. So she's in an institute and slowly fading away. And the story actually happens on the day when she passes away. And Ruth gets the phone call and Kobi is abroad. So I will read from it. This is called Shoot Me in the Head. If it happens to me, shoot me in the head. Kobi would say that every time he returned from her. And Ruth would soothe and console him, remind him that at this point she's at the merciful phase. She has no idea what's going on. Unlike the beginning when her lucidity played cruel games with her mind. Now she doesn't know anything. It doesn't matter. It's not a life. Shoot me in the head. And she promised again and again. I'll try to commit suicide first, he'd emphasize. That's very considerate of you. But I may not have the time. I might go from being pretty okay to utterly unbearable in a very short period of time, and then I'll shoot you in the head. She completed the sentence as required. Can we eat now? There was a time in the beginning when she offered to accompany him on his visits. Atalia would come and go, sharp and alert one day, drowsy and confused the next, and Kobi evaded her. And when she realized that he hadn't told her about them, she was insulted. But then she scolded herself. Why are you pushing him? What does that matter? He has enough to deal with. When he'll want her to come, she thought, he'll invite her. He never invited her. And over the years, the idea of her joining him for a visit became odd, bizarre even, like going to work with him in the morning or joining him when he goes to the bathroom. Something that's technically possible, but hard to justify. Now she's stuck in front of her closet, scolding herself again. That's what matters now, if you wear pants or a skirt. She chooses the Castro jeans, the ones that fit her really well, and the purple sweater and the high-heeled boots, the ones that add 5 full centimeters to her 158. In front of the bathroom mirror, she wets her hair a little. She really should have gone to the hairdresser last week as she planned. Pulls it back, rolls it around, and ties it in a hairband. But not a few seconds go by and it rebels, and a few rogue curls bounce around her forehead, and only after she powders her cheeks with blush and says, "Enough," out loud, is she able to pull herself away. On her way to the door, she passes the photographs of Atalia hanging throughout the house, lots of photos. They decorated the walls since the first time she visited the house, and she never doubted their right to keep their place. As a matter of fact, shortly after she moved in, she stopped seeing them altogether. And only when her sister came to visit for the first time and said, "And where are your pictures, Ruti?" did she feel a pang of embarrassment when she directed her to the fridge, pointing at 2 picture magnets from a friend's wedding and a picture of her and Kobi with the boys from an Independence Day picnic. And Racheli asked whether the photos were hung before it all started or after. And Ruth didn't have an answer because she had never asked. Narcissism or memory?
Even though this story is told from the perspective of Ruti, and she is the central character, and she's in her life, she's married to the love of her life, she's still such an outsider.
Yeah.
Where does this deep alienation come from? It's hard to imagine that sense of alienation comes from your personal experience, or are you simply drawn to finding out about people who are alienated?
I am drawn to the struggle of people who are captured within their own limitations. That's what interests me more than anything. And Ruti is in many ways living her dream life, and she has this description later in the stories that when she goes to university functions, people always mistake her. They think she's a research assistant, they think she's the kid's nanny, and when they realize that they're not married, but that she's the wife per se, then they're always surprised, and they look at her condescendingly. And so, and then her sister reminds her, she says, "You're saving 3 people's lives, Kobe and his 2 sons, you're saving their lives, and, the rest of the university assholes can go to hell." So she is in love with a man who truly loves her, and she has a beautiful life, and she cannot let go of the sensation that it's not really hers. And there's also a great deal of truth about that, because I think a lot of the times that things that torment us do have a grain of truth in them. She did find the love of her life because his wife fell ill, and nonetheless, this is her life. This is the life she has.
These are deep and difficult and troubling and sometimes very disturbing stories. In your background, you worked for a long time on the Israeli hit satire show, Eretz Nehederet, It's a Wonderful Country. And that has a lot of fun, and, it's mostly a humor show. It's also even bordering on slapstick. Mm-hmm. How did you make that transition? Or do you try to...
Well, I have to say, I write a very popular weekly column for Shiva Yamim and Yediot Ahronot, and most weeks my column is funny. Often it's written in the format of a WhatsApp conversation, so sometimes it's a WhatsApp group for a kindergarten, and sometimes it's a group for a family. I have several of these groups going on, and they're always very, very funny. At the end of the day, I honestly think that it's not a big transition to make, because I think that the raw place where humor comes from and where writing that is, perhaps more painful comes from, they're very close to one another, because a lot of it has to do with admitting to human weakness. Humor has a lot to do with that. When you write about humor, when I write this WhatsApp group of all the parents in the kindergarten, I'm really writing about parenthood, and we're all trying to do our best, and we're all failing all the time, and we all, build up these ideologies and these, concepts of how one should raise children, and nobody's right, nobody's wrong. We're just all muddling through it.
But what about the different platforms? Is TV writing or screenwriting very different to literature writing, or is it an essentially similar creative process?
They're writing first, they're very different. First of all, because the process of writing for TV, and certainly for a weekly show, and certainly for a show that is dependent on current events, is a team effort. So, and I did several of these shows. Eretz Nederet is one of them, but I did several shows that were weekly shows and had to do with satire and current events. And you sit in a room, you sit in a writer's room, which is an experience in and of itself. Often the only woman in the room as well, which is also an experience in and of itself. But you sit in a room, and there are a lot of people bouncing off ideas, and then you make a decision about what the show will and won't contain, and then people go off, and they usually also write in teams of 2 or 3. So a lot of that is a group effort.
And a pressing deadline, of course.
The pressing deadline. And then, working on the novel is a far more solitary work process. You spend most of your time alone. Only in a very late stage of the process does the editor come in, and Hila Bloom edited ציפייה. She's a wonderful editor. She edits everything. Edgar Keret writes. She's very experienced in short story writing, and also a lot of the greatest writers. Amir Gottfreund, she's really terrific. But nonetheless, the editor comes in at a fairly late phase. So it's a very, very solitary act. And for me, what would happen is when I would really dive into a story, the characters would become my company, and we had good days and bad days, Some days they cooperated, some days I got really pissed off.
Who was more annoying, you or the characters?
Did you ever go to therapy or counseling to work this out?
Probably me.
I thought I would ask you a little bit about your grandfather, not so much because you come from that family, but because you've also been sort of active in sort of being part of his public persona. I'll just remind or tell listeners who probably don't know that you made a video shortly after, when he was leaving the office of the president, starring him theoretically looking for a job. What does he do now?
It's called Shimon Peres Goes Job Hunting.
Yeah. So first of all, maybe tell us why that video. I mean, I want to focus on your work, so I'm curious where that came from. And then maybe we can get your thoughts and perspectives, just over a year since his passing.
Well, we were very close, and part of our relationship had to do with writing. He was a very avid reader of my column, and he would almost always call me and give me his opinion and his thoughts. And I would sometimes consult with him within the writing process. And I'm happy to say that he would also send me things that he was working on. And so when he was reaching the end of his 7-year term as president, he sent me this document that was called Letter to a Young Friend. And it was a collection of anecdotes and sayings and things he had experienced and things that he wanted to leave for the younger generation. And it was probably about, I would say, 30 pages long or so. And it had a lot of beautiful things in it, but I read it and I called him and I said, okay, this is great. Who's the target audience? And he said, young people. And I said, and how will these young people be exposed to all of these wonderful ideas? And he said, well, I thought we'd, print a little booklet and hand it out.
Hand it out? He thought he would just walk around the street.
Or I don't know, in bookstores, or attach it to a newspaper or something like that. I mean, it wasn't, unimaginable way. But
that's so sweet that he actually thought that young people read newspapers.
Yeah, exactly.
Very sweet.
Or read at all.
In response, I said,
Facebook.
Exactly. So in response, I said, well, if you want young people, it needs to be much shorter. It needs to be on video, and it better be very funny. And I have to say that he was game from day one. And then actually what I did was I took this document and I gathered a group of probably around 8 of my screenwriting friends in my living room, and I handed out copies of it. And I said, what are we going to do? And we came to the idea that the question, despite the fact that he was at this point almost 91 years old, and despite the fact the question that everyone was asking was, what will Peres do next? And there was even this talk of whether he was going to go into politics again, which is ridiculous. But
did he consider it?
No, he did not. But, we realized that for the first time in 70 years, he was unemployed. And so we said, okay. And then that came down to the idea, which is the principle on which the script is based, that each of the scenes had to go as far as we possibly could with, he's a pizza delivery man, and he tries stand-up, and he's works at a gas station. But each of these scenes needed to go as far as we could with the comedy, but it was based on one of the principles that was written in this document that he had given me. And that's what we set out to do. And it was a big secret. And we managed to shoot it really under the radar. We worked on it, to shoot here and there and all over. It's a pretty complicated little video.
Did you actually go skydiving? Did he actually go skydiving?
So many people
I don't want to give too much away.
No. Well, first of all, everyone should see it. You should Google Shimon Peres goes job hunting. So many people ask me that. No, it's a green screen. We did shoot him in the skydiving plane sitting, and then he made this motion of, as if he was going to jump out, and then the part of, it's a double who actually jumps out of the plane. But, when people actually ask me that question, I said, he did not skydive, but only because I wouldn't let him.
You said, Saba, no.
No, because
he did,
really.
He did a great job, and the response was fantastic, and it was a lot of fun because I really kind of hosted him in my territory. We got to spend a lot of time together. We got to work together, and the clip got fantastic responses. It went viral. People saw it all over the world.
I think as a wrap-up question, I'd like to ask you, how do you think being so close to a person who is so integral to the history of Israel for so many years and decades, that must have sort of been a major part of just who you are. Mm-hmm. Do you think that it comes out in your writing at all, or you just say, no, actually, I'm writing from a completely independent perspective? But do these things seep into who you are as a person?
I would say that I write from a completely independent perspective. It has obviously been a big part of my life and is a big part of my life. And for many, many years, I very much shied away from it. I didn't want to have almost anything to do with it. And only now, in the past few years, I've grown more comfortable with it, and I experience it more as the privilege that it is and less as the burden that it also is, because it really is both. A privilege because I got to grow up with him and we were close, and I, experienced him and his thinking and the many things that he did, and I had a lot of experiences that I shared with him. But it's also a privilege because, the description that I often use is that you have this title, and the title is the granddaughter of Shimon Peres. And this title has this tendency of walking into the room before you do. And I was never willing to accept that. I want to walk into the room, and then I want to decide if I invite the title to join me or not, And there's actually, in the making of the Shimon Peres Goes Job Hunting, I felt like we were cooperating, the title and me. I felt like we were working together because I was doing my thing. The writing was mine, and I really believed in the product that we were making. And I also knew that it was going to serve him in a way that was really important to me.
Fascinating. I think that's very interesting about your life with your imaginary friends or alter egos.
Yeah.
And we get to experience it too in the book and in the video too, I guess, if people want to watch that. That's Mika Almog talking about her collection of short stories, Anticipation, published only in Hebrew for now, but for our very devoted fans and our really devoted donors, she's translated one story, and we will send it to you as a gift for a donation, even a modest one. Please get in touch with us. Write to Gilad at GILAD at tlv1.fm. And a big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. We would also like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Romay Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. And now you have an opportunity to help us survive. Go to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and please donate to our Patreon campaign. You'll be part of the quest for learning and knowledge, and you'll get gifts. And many thanks to those of you who already have made a donation. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive. We have over 400 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and hopefully even a little bit annoyed. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And follow both Gilad and me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.